Hello, Nancy.
Hi, Pierre. How are you?
I'm very fine. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
It's so good to have you again.
Thank you. It's good to be here also. I'm honored.
Thank you. Thank you. Last time we had an interview about your life journey, what you have gone through, how was the life, how were the experiences of the life. And today we are very focused on your specialty, your the topic which you are an expert of, early
Yes,
age development of a terrorist.
yes.
Terrorism is a weird word. Uh, I guess we both and everyone doesn't want to listen it.
Mhm.
It horrifies terrorism, terrorists,
Yes.
and I'm curious about how kids start becoming extremists and then extremists become terrorists. How this whole thing works.
Yes, it's a very big question and area, and I do something that's really very unique in that I look at early childhood development of the mind and body language of the terrorists. And my work started back in 1983 when the truck bombs went off in Lebanon. And I was in my early stages of training to become a psychoanalyst, and I was treating patients and very much involved with trauma. And I was seeing the victims. And at one point along the way, I began to think about the perpetrator, the mind of the terrorist, and why they would inflict this kind of horrific behavior onto us. And I began to do what I call the deep dive into the psyche of the terrorist. And into understanding at a deep level psychology, because this is the terrain of psychoanalysis. It's different from other psychologies. And one of the things is that we forget right now. Artificial intelligence is very, very popular and it's being used extensively. And this is a very good thing. And it's recognized that 95% of what we think is unconscious. So the unconscious involves this deep dive, and this is the meat and potatoes of psychoanalysis. So when you ask, how do children become involved in terrorism? I like to look at it, pushing it way back into the home, where one first learns and experiences terrors. And I took the title for this little talk tonight, Prologue to Violence, actually from a book of a colleague, Abby Stein, and she wrote a book called Prologue to Violence, Child Abuse, Disassociation, and Trauma. And unfortunately, Abby died way too young, but she was a criminologist as well. And she looked at the mind of the of criminals. And I began to also see, well, because I consider terrorism a form of criminality, that it would be also applicable to start looking at early childhood behavior. Now, it's a bit unusual. We tend to look at the children um, as being brainwashed. And I say it's much, much more than that. It's much deeper and it's rooted in family dynamics with histories of abuse. And one of the things, there's a very famous Egyptian sociologist named Halim Barakat, and he essentially said that the family is a microcosm of society. And if you want a stable society, you very much want a stable home. And this becomes very complicated when you start looking at terrorist groups. All terrorist groups come out of shame, honor cultures across the board. And I'm not only talking about shame, honor cultures, say, in the Middle East, um, but worldwide. Uh, and you have also in the West, we also have shame, honor families. That's what I like to call, uh, where kids are experiencing something pretty similar. But the
Yeah.
difference in shame, honor cultures is how there is a psychological prohibition to separate from the mother. And this is like a compensation for the fact that the male baby and the male is given more worth in a patriarchal culture than the female. So we don't mean it to be like this, but this is the way it's evolved culturally.
Hmm.
And it's a very delicate matter to discuss, even here publicly in a way. Um,
True.
but we underestimate the impact of the shaming that goes on and some of the contours within the culture. Now, when I first started doing this work, I looked at suicide terrorism, and
Hmm.
I felt, because of Lebanon in particular, when the truck bombs went off, I felt that this was a culture that's become undone, and so it's
Hmm.
the far end of negativity, so to speak.
Hmm.
To use suicide bombing in this way, and I said, this is murder suicide.
Hmm.
And where else do you find murder suicide? You also find it in the West in the template of domestic violence. It's very common. And I looked deeper and deeper, and one of the things that we know about domestic violence is that it indicates a kind of traumatic bonding of the perpetrator that the perpetrator experienced very early in the relationship with his mother. So this is not to blame the mother, but to understand psychologically the deeper dynamics of it. And actually, I was censored when when I first drew this parallel between uh, murder suicide of domestic violence and murder suicide in political terrorism. And there were a couple of things. I think that the terror runs so deep around the issue of maternal attachment, this very early period in life, that it's very off-putting. That's one. The other thing is the definition for political violence is so narrow that it doesn't really afford looking at early childhood development. Now, that was when I was first entering the field. Now it's become a bit more acceptable, and the the macho counter-terrorist experts are beginning to think about these kinds of backgrounds of suicide bombers and the uh, whole cohort of those involved in the terrorist organization. I mean, the suicide bomber is the most expendable and is a victimizer. He's scapegoated, or she's scapegoated by their own group. But to back up for a second, in 2008, in the United Kingdom, the Center for Social Cohesion did geomapping which means that they did a map and they looked at where terrorists were, and then they also looked at where domestic violence was. And lo and behold, they overlapped, so that there were incidences of domestic violence and there were also terrorists. Now, the FBI, around this same time, realized that 60% of the first contacts with police of terrorists were actually issues around domestic violence. So that they first presented as having problems from within the home, and then these guys escalated into becoming political terrorists. So the sense of rage is there early on, and it just gets refocused or recast under the guise of political ideologies. This kind of shift indicates that the ideologies, they're important, no question about it, but they merely harness unconscious, rageful fantasies that pre-existed, that were there before. And this well of violent fantasies arose very early in the life of the child. So this is part of the purview of the terrorists. Now, there's one thing, too, that people may not be so aware of, that the terrorists actually, they can't really feel their terrors. They're not the kind of guys who are going to turn the corner and take a hard look at themselves and say, gee, why am I so enraged? What is this all about? They're not curious like that psychologically. Instead, they become the terror themselves, and it's projected into us at an unconscious level that we're not even really aware of, that gets us to act or react. And so it's through this mechanism of projection that they split off what they don't like about themselves and they offload it onto us. This goes back to very early issues around shame. You may have heard of the expression, the shame blame game, that blaming becomes the vehicle of offloading what they don't feel good about themselves. And this is something very, very early. There is a Cypriot Turkish Muslim psychoanalyst named Vamik Volkan, who's written many, many books. And he states that the need to hate and the need to have an enemy is in place by age 3. So it's all there, but it might not be recognized, and that it can be overlooked within the family dynamics and within the community. But the prologue to the violence is really pretty much in place. And
Hmm.
one of the things, um, in Arab Muslim culture, shame honor culture,
Hmm.
in order to cleanse honor, you must willfully spill blood.
Hmm.
This is how you redeem your honor. And so this involves uh, uh, sort of covering up all the issues around the shame and where that's coming from, and why should it have to move to the position of actually having to spill blood to feel like you have recuperated a sense of self when you've
Hmm.
been humiliated and shamed. It's very, very extreme. Um, it would be um, more optimal to see an individual feel able to be self-standing and to tolerate
Hmm.
being
Hmm.
humiliated, because not everybody reacts to humiliation to have to seek revenge. But this is the purview in shame honor cultures. And you see this across the board. And the other aspect of shame honor cultures is that the group self is more important than the individual self.
Hmm.
And while the group is important, it's excessive because
Hmm.
it sort of inhibits the ability to individuate from the group, to separate also from the mother, because there's a psychological prohibition. So it's a complicated situation, but you find it
Hmm.
in, for example, the Hamula here
Hmm.
in Israel, the type in Chechnya, the Kabyle in Somalia, the Kabila in other places. Um, so that this is an aspect that, if we want to see a lessening of violence, it's going to be really important to try to get a better understanding around shame and
Hmm.
shame practices. Um, for example, for a child,
Hmm.
um, often a child will be, little kids like to explore, and they're
Yeah.
very inquisitive, and
Yeah.
their minds are developing, and the world is exciting. And then something will happen. One of my friends wrote a book about, his name is Paul Hollinger, when what babies say before they talk. And he has this beautiful example of a baby sitting in a high chair,
Hmm.
and the baby pours the milk over the side of the table of the tray of the high chair. And all of a sudden, the mother reacts and starts yelling at the baby. And
Hmm.
it's a moment where the baby feels probably shamed, like, oh,
Hmm.
what happened? And it's a micro moment, it's a little slice out of everyday life,
Hmm.
or the mother or the father. I don't want to just place
Yeah.
it on the mother. It's not nice. But rather to take a different strategy, to join with the child and say, oh, look at how the milk flows over the tray,
Hmm.
cascading onto the floor. Isn't that interesting?
Hmm.
Why do you think it's doing that? To elicit a curiosity, to enhance the child's um, sense of self, and then say, okay, now we're going to clean that up, and we can't do this all the time. You can't spill milk all the time. But it's a micro moment of where shame can easily crush a child. The other
Hmm.
the other thing about the terrorists is that, so I'm talking about maternal attachment and the early years, the bond with the mother. Um, and the terrorists, we see they have a problem in bonding because they literally bond to us violently. So
Okay.
that shows us that they don't know how to relate to people. They don't have that capacity. They didn't develop it in some way. So um, the roots are deep, and there's many aspects to what I'm saying, but one of
Like they
them,
feel themselves left out, people.
pardon?
They feel themselves like a left out person.
Yes, that they don't fit in some way because they miss some developmental step in learning how to relate to people.
Hmm.
The terrorists view us as objects
Hmm.
because they were treated as objects. And in a very sort of extreme expression, because in shame honor culture, you have many variation, and not everybody is the same and all. But
Hmm.
where there's a higher frequency of child abuse and more deprivation, these kinds of things, they the it's been much more difficult for them to feel like uh, human beings because they've had a harder time getting their needs met. In shame honor cultures, needs are often viewed as being dirty and
Hmm.
toxic. So therefore, you get into this projection of blaming the others when one feels shamed or humiliated. So it's very painful. And shame is different from guilt because guilt has this sense of you're able to make reparations and you're able to see that you've done something wrong to the other person. But shame is much more limited in that kind of awareness.
Hmm.
So they do they show us that they struggle to relate to people. It's very difficult in many ways. And I say, when I started working on looking at their behavior, I would say mute the button on the TV and just look at the imagery and
Hmm.
look how they bond to hard objects. They like weapons. And this is a way of giving themselves structure, that the psychological structure that they feel like they're missing. So they
Hmm.
speak to us in a kind of a pantomime about their own terrors
Hmm.
that they're not aware of. And one of them is this terror in attachment, how to be in a relationship.
That's right. That's right. And what do you think? Like, so complex issue. Even thinking about having a child involving in such activities, and on a stage, he is becoming complete terrorist, and he is ready to kill people. Like we have seen many videos here in Pakistan when there were Taliban in Sawat, and they were like training. Initially, they were training the kids to slaughter people. and then they the kids they have done it. They
Yes,
slaughtered, and
yes,
I was like, I cannot see blood in the
yes,
age of 42.
yes,
Uh, but I was surprised. I I was not able to watch those videos, but
yes,
there were kids who were slaughtering human being, and it
yes,
so disturbing.
yes,
And what
very.
was the state of mind they are going through, and how, like, I was failed to understand.
Yes, it's devastating what how horrifically they have been abused by being forced into killing. And this is the extreme expression because the terrorists who prey on the children, they don't see them as children. They see them as objects that they can manipulate and torture through the process of this. And terrorist behavior is extremely concrete, so that they have uh, they have a rage that exceeds murder itself. So there's this constant mutilation and uh, production of body parts. This was the other thing when I started to work in looking at suicide bombing. I asked myself, because I would read in the newspapers that it would always come up about body parts, and I said to myself, where else do body parts occur in crime? And I looked, and I wasn't trained as a criminologist, but I discovered that they're routinely found in serial killing. And the serial killer creates a tableau where he will dismantle the body of his victim to send a message to the police to taunt them to find to find the serial killer. And all the serial killers have this very disturbed bonding with the mother and the production of body parts. So part of my task as a psychoanalyst is to ask, what is the significance of body parts? And I found somebody another psychoanalyst who wrote on this, Bivin, and they are in psychology. We have this expression, part object. And when the baby is first born, the baby does not know the mother as a whole human being. Rather, the baby knows the mother in sort of bits and pieces through the mouth, the gaze, the smell, the touch. And these are called part objects. And in serial killing, the body parts are a concrete representation of the mother's body. Now, I realize that this might be very difficult for people to take this deep dive as I'm proposing, but I contend that the terror that when the terror aspect of suicide bombing was so effective because it would tap into our own terrors that we have with our mothers. I mean, everybody has some terrors when we were little. We have them. We don't remember them. We remember them unconsciously. And everybody has a mother. So I said it was sort of like this global Wi-Fi that the terrorists could tap into to impact on us and to create havoc. And another example, when 9/11 happened, and I was in Minneapolis and I saw it on TV, and it was horrific to see the twin towers and the planes and the people. And it was just, there were just no words.
Yeah.
But then I thought, oh my God, they're like little boys who build towers out of clay blocks and knock them down. That they don't, the terrorists, I mean, if you step back far enough, you can distill what the terrorists are doing, and you can see their terrors, what they never mastered. So in other words, growing up, their sense of play was inhibited greatly. We know that play is very, very, very important. And actually, when children have problems, we like to engage them in play therapy to be able to express their terrors, because they haven't yet mastered language enough to link up the terror and to put it into words, to demystify it so that it's not so overwhelming, so that instead of being terrorized, they can find a space to be calm and be able to explore and to have a sense of joy and happiness. And but with these terrorists, you can literally see how they missed many things in their development. And there's probably, in my opinion, there's a broad spectrum of different psychopathologies and different ways of describing. There are many, but basically their behavior is very concrete. And I like to use the term as a descriptor, not as a diagnostic, of autistic, because they remind me in ways too of kids who have difficulties in relating to the real world, that they're sort of locked into a world of fantasy that they haven't been able to break out of. So it's similar, and I want to be very careful and say, of course, autistic kids are not going to grow up to be terrorists, but there is this parallel that one can see in the concrete nature of their behavior. This leads me to sort of related. It's not strictly on terrorism, but if I could, I was talking to you before we went on the air about the situation of Corona. And here in Israel, we're facing lockdown. And there are two sectors in particular that are very much in denial about how terrible this virus is. And there was just an article that I read about an hour before your program on the Arab sector, and it was an Arab doctor speaking. He said there are very high rates in the Arab sector and also in the Haredi sector, in the ultra-Orthodox sector. And these groups are groups where the group self is more important than the individual self. So they haven't gone through this sort of more individuation, separation that you would see in other sectors. There is sort of a lack of personal boundaries, and for a contagion, this is what a contagion thrives on. But here you see similarities to what I'm talking with regard to terrorists, but they come out of a shame honor culture, but they're their subculture of terrorism is even a hyper shame honor culture, so to speak. So there are these links, and the Arab physician said that he hoped that he would be proven wrong, but he felt that not until enough people died in the community would people only then begin to understand the deadly nature of the virus. And so here you have an example where it has to become concrete. Death, you have to know it more personally to break through the denial. And denial, it plays a big role in all of this and how we look at the terrorism and deal with it.
Yes. And Dr. Nancy, I would like to ask you a very important question. What is the solution?
First of all, I'm very optimistic. The mere fact that you and I are talking about terrorism in this way, linked to early childhood, and I may not have been so eloquent in putting it all together because it is a bit complicated, but I believe that if we really begin to deal with early childhood development and most especially understand shame, and the son of Hamas, Musab Hassan Yusuf, said that the greatest enemy was shame. So he really, in my opinion, understood what the underlying problem is. So this is a problem that is fixable if we address and understand the significance of early child development. And I want to stress in Arab Muslim culture, the little female girl really gains honor only when she has her firstborn male at a much later date. And what we forget is that this little girl, because she was at the bottom of the totem pole of the hierarchy, experienced a lot of demands being placed on her, controlling and shaming, etc. But she's the one who's going to make the baby. She's going to carry out the significant part of the bonding experience with the baby. And I'd like to say that we forget that the mother is sort of like the computer company Intel, that the brain of the baby quadruples from in utero to the time of age 3. So she's really helping building the brain. And then in the bonding, the role of oxytocin is very, very important, the hormone for bonding. And so we don't want the mother to be stressed. And this is, and we sort of underestimate that and how it will impact on the bonding with the baby. So shame is one thing. And the second is, if I could wish it, no physical punishment whatsoever, no hitting, because hitting is bonding negatively with the child. Hitting, this is where they begin to learn to bond violently, and we don't want that. We want the direct opposite of that. We want things to be much calmer, more optimal, a lot of exploring and inquisitiveness. But physical punishment it's very difficult. And my friend who wrote the book on what babies say before they can talk, because you can read the baby's communication, nonverbal communication. He also just finished a whole volume on physical punishment and the detriment, and how it's really so counterproductive. It doesn't need to be done in this day and age. I would also like to see very much things like in cultures like beheading to be outlawed, not to be resorted to as a death penalty. I think this speaks back to the dismantling of the mother's body. Actually, it's an attack on the mother's body. That's what it is in terms of fantasy. And we all want to have our mothers intact and at whole. You know, we want to preserve the goodness of the nurturing, and that's why I think it is possible to make these changes, and I do think things will be better. However, I have to say, with regard to the terrorists, I think basically they're too far gone. It's very hard to remediate them. We know it's very hard to remediate pedophiles, and it's very, very difficult. There might be a small percent that can be de-radicalized, but the information is not in yet, and there's a lot of people working, but it's very, very difficult work because the personalities are quite fragile and brittle. They don't have the flexibility. I mean, it actually takes a lot not to feel, to be shamed, to be able to move beyond that, to give up hating. Maybe that would be another aspect that I would put on my wish list, what we could do. I never use the word hate. If I'm upset, I say I intensely dislike. Now, I only know a little Urdu. I read a sentence a day, but so I don't know how it plays out in Urdu, but hate in English, it winds up getting into this binary of love-hate. And we really need to move into an area to accept the gray, to accept what's in between, rather than these two very polarized extreme. And it should be because that will make us more tolerant also.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. So those are some of the things that would be on my wish list. But it's doable.
Yeah, these are doable. And I'm very thankful, Dr. Nancy, for your time, for your thoughts, for sharing with us. And this is such a great topic that I don't think that we are covering it up in a single session. We need more sessions in it. And I'm sure that you will give me time again and we will sit together again.
Oh, thank you. I would be honored. I'm here to help. I would like to help. But thank you so much, and thank you.
I really appreciate that you are helping this whole series of P-Talks with a true spirit, and we are doing a lot because of you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure, and I'm enjoying it greatly. And really, I'm here to help. and I remain optimistic. And that's the one thing you want to remain optimistic, because the terrorists can't tolerate that you could be optimistic, because
Yeah,
they aren't. They're
they are.
sad. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's sad.
that's
It's
right.
tragic.
Thank
Very
you.
good. You're welcome. Good night.
And we will see you again, inshallah, soon.
Thank you. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.